But we would like to begin, and I'm really honored that we're able to have Reverend Marilyn Sewell here this weekend. Marilyn is a prodigious author and editor of many books, which we all have for sale in our bookstore, and there will be a few times where she will also be able to sign some books for you, so please go buy books. And she was the minister of First Unitarian Church of Portland, Oregon, which grew exponentially during her ministry there. She has long been a prophetic voice for the social justice and witness that Unitarian Universalists love to talk about, and she inspires us to put that talk into action and live it every day in our lives. So without further ado, Marilyn, I'm thrilled that you're here.
Thank you so much, Dory, and all of you for inviting me here. I know a good many of you from past experiences in the UUA, and I'm very pleased to see you again and to meet some new faces. You know, I feel a bit apologetic in that you folks have been sitting for a very long time. And now I'm asking you to sit again, and I feel like what you really need is a line dance or something. Yeah, you really need a party, or at least a speech that's very entertaining, and I can't promise you that. I have tried to be informative and I hope helpful, but I do apologize for asking you to sit for, it's going to be 45 minutes. So, but I will do my best to be with you as you have asked me to be with you, to speak on leadership and spirituality. So I've been asked to speak on this topic, like what is the relationship between these two concepts? I began to ask myself, are they compatible concepts, or is spiritual leadership really a kind of oxymoron? Now let me explain. Spirituality is not essentially pragmatic, something leading to a goal. It's a relationship with a mystery, with a capital M. It's about listening and yielding and opening and softening and letting go. The fruits of the Spirit are classical through the ages and similar no matter what the faith traditions: humility, compassion, gratitude, kindness, presence, and generosity of spirit. In contrast, leaders are generally thought to be tough, powerful, and unyielding, strong of ego, passionate about their vision, and thrusting boldly where none have dared to go before. So I ask you, are these concepts compatible? Is spirituality from Venus and leadership from Mars? No, I think not at all. Good leaders are both yin and yang. That is, they evidence a combination of both masculine and feminine principles that are complementary, not contradictory. Certainly our greatest leaders, both religious leaders and political leaders, have been spiritually grounded. I give you, for example, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Margaret Sanger, Eleanor Roosevelt. Just for example, this is not to say that any one of these individuals was saintly or without flaw, but each was moved by purpose and principle beyond himself or herself, and each changed the world for the better in significant ways. And they were very different personality types. So, being a leader does not require having a certain kind of personality. Well, then what are the criteria for leadership? Let me clarify. One might say, by some measures, that Hitler was a great leader, or maybe Jim Jones. Well, these two men certainly were strong leaders in that they were charismatic. They inspired many people to follow their vision. But I'm not including these kinds of leaders in my definition of a great leader. The ancient linguistic root of the word lead means to go forth and to die. So the forward motion is there, or the yang, and the dying to self, or the yin. True leaders don't necessarily set out to be leaders. I believe they are called into leadership by history and by circumstance, and by their own qualities of character. Some kind of adaptive change is needed in an institution or maybe in society at large, and so a leader comes forth. They are visionaries who see a future that is not yet visible to their followers, and they can articulate that vision in such a way that will inspire others to own the problem and to redeem that situation. To go forth and to die. This is the operative phrase. Great leaders are able to die to self in service to the greater good. A story. This story is about Eleanor Roosevelt and the Tuskegee Airmen of World War II. These pilots were excellent flyers, but as we entered the war, they were not allowed to fly in combat simply because they were African Americans and they were not trusted. It looked as though they were going to spend all of their flying time in the war grounded at their Alabama training field. And then Eleanor Roosevelt heard about their plight. Against all advice, she went to Tuskegee and visited the airmen. It looked as though it was just going to be a photo op. But then she surprised everyone by saying, "I'd like to go up for a ride." She climbed into a small plane, and an hour later, they landed. The wife of the President of the United States led the country to the understanding that the Tuskegee Airmen deserved to fly for their country, and fly they did. They were escort planes for the B-17 and the B-24 bombers attacking Germany's industrial complex at the end of the war. The Tuskegee Airmen proved themselves to be such superior pilots in their B-51 Mustang fighters that bomber crews universally requested them to be their escorts. Tuskegee Airmen earned approximately 1,000 awards and decorations by the end of the war. The Tuskegee Airmen led so that others might have an easier path to follow. And what about Eleanor Roosevelt? What did she do as a leader? She embodied many of the qualities of a leader. She was tough, and she was willing to go against the grain. She was not caught up in her own ego needs, but she had rather given herself to a higher purpose. She acted decisively out of her own convictions, and she was grounded in sound values, elevating the values of those around her. Leadership requires courage. It requires saying yes when the powers that be are saying no. It requires making some people uncomfortable, and chances are that those people will make you uncomfortable. If you want to be popular and well-liked, if you are afraid to ruffle feathers, if you want everybody to love you, you will not be able to be a leader. Good leaders are clear and decisive. They're willing to take a stand, even though they know they will never have all the information they may need, because we never have all the information we need. Now, we've all seen people in positions of authority who refuse to lead, or who can't lead maybe. Maybe it's the mayor of a city, or maybe it's the board chair of your church. If the leader doesn't lead, followers are left insecure and without direction. Remember what Alice asks the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland? "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" Alice asked the Cheshire Cat. "Well, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to," said the cat. "I don't much care where," said Alice. "Well, then it doesn't matter which way you go," said the cat. "So long as I get somewhere," Alice added as an explanation. "Well, you're sure to do that," said the cat, "if only you walk long enough." That wonderful kind of nonsense in Lewis Carroll's book. It's so close to home. All too often, churches fall into that kind of aimlessness. Many churches don't know what their mission is other than pleasing themselves. I was with a church staff just recently, and I was talking with them, and I said, "Do you know what your mission is?" And they looked around at one another, and they said, "Well, we're really not sure." And finally, one of them said, "Well, our mission is to grow." No, a mission is not to grow. To grow to what end? Why are we existing? Why would we grow? Do you know what your church's mission is? I ask each one of you, do you know what your church's mission is? Can you state it in 10 words or less, or maybe 15 words or less? If you can't, then I wonder if you know why your institution exists. And if you don't know why it exists, well, that's a problem. Every institution needs to ask constantly, where are we going and why? If we are clear about that, the easier piece is getting there. A good leader helps an organization define and clarify its purpose. Now, leaders are willing to put some greater objective ahead of personal gain. Leadership is not about individual accomplishment or self-aggrandizement. In simple terms, it's about giving your talents and your energies to making the world a better place. A leader can call a people to do great things. They can draw from them qualities that they never even knew were there, can call them to be their noblest selves. I don't know how many of you know about Sir Ernest Shackleton and his leadership, but he was an amazing person. In 1914, he went on his third trip to Antarctica. His ship was ironically named the Endurance. It got stuck in ice in 1915 and was slowly crushed and went down. So Shackleton was faced with the daunting task of getting his 27 men safely back home. It's not that they didn't know what they were in for. This is how he advertised for his crew. He put out this advertisement: men wanted for hazardous journey, period. Small wages, period. Bitter cold, period. Long months of complete darkness, period. Constant danger, period. Safe return, doubtful, period. Honor and recognition in case of success, period. Well, pretty daunting. So they lost the ship, of course, and there they were, in Antarctica, no ship. And the ship's doctor reported that he told them, Shackleton told them simply and calmly, that they would have to spend the winter in pack. In other words, on an ice floe. After almost 2 months, the ice floe broke in two, and so Shackleton ordered the men to get in lifeboats, and they did. And after 5 days, they landed on an uninhabited island. Then Shackleton chose 5 companions, and they rowed 800 miles over stormy seas in constant peril to this island, South Georgia Island, which was a whaling station. And then they traveled 32 miles over mountainous terrain by foot to the whaling station, if you can imagine this. Then Shackleton engaged Chileans to go back and rescue the 22 others who had been left isolated for 4.5 months. So this saga went on for almost 2 years, and every single man was brought back home safely. So pretty amazing. They looked to him for physical and emotional support. They knew what they were getting into. He had, after all, warned them, even in the advertisement. And his calm and his confidence brought them all home safely. His men were his first priority, and he was an amazing leader. Ronald Heifetz, who has written and lectured widely about leadership, says that the single most important characteristic of a leader is self-differentiation. Now, what is self-differentiation? It includes, first and foremost, a knowledge of self. A leader can be clear because he knows himself well, accepts both his strengths and his weaknesses, and knows what purposes he is living for. So as an individual, you know why you are living what you are about as a human being. She has convictions that are strong and clear, and an ability to stand firm when pressured by others. In the self-differentiated person, boundaries are clear, projections of other people are not taken in. They know who they are, and they feel no need to please everyone. Another story. a man was traveling down a long, dusty road with his wife, his child, and his donkey. They passed someone on the road who said to the man, "Shame on you letting your child walk. You should let your child ride on the donkey." And so the man put his child on the donkey and continued. And soon they passed another traveler who said to the man, "You should be ashamed making your wife walk on this hot day. You should let her ride on the donkey." And so he put his wife on the donkey. They went on and soon came to a third traveler who said to the man, in no uncertain terms, "You should be ashamed. Look at this poor donkey carrying this heavy load in the sweltering heat." Whereupon the man put the donkey on his back and continued down the road. The self-differentiated leader doesn't put the donkey on his back. To be self-differentiated, though, does not mean that the leader is inflexible, of course, and will not listen to others. She should always be testing her views against competing views rather than defensively sticking to a particular perspective. He also needs to be in touch with the emotional state of the followers. Now, Shackleton seemed to be very much the leader, the traditional, male stereotypical leader, but he must have been in touch with the emotional state of those men, or he could not have prevailed. A good leader knows that change is difficult and understands the human need for protection and order. He's compassionate when he knows that change is distressing for people. Sometimes, your church is growing, and you may think it's just great, having all these new people come into the church. But then you hear people saying, "Well, I don't know the people anymore," or "I just can't find a seat in my church anymore." So people do find change, even good change, very distressing sometimes. So we need to be compassionate, but it's not a soft kind of compassion. It's not a soft kind of compassion because the good leader does not allow the followers much leeway to escape the difficult work that they must do. Sometimes change needs to happen, but an organization or a society does not feel enough stress or pressure to make the needed change. Now, this is our problem at the present time with global warming. Until people are uncomfortable enough, until gas prices are high enough, and I understand that you have the highest gas in the nation here, is that right? Congratulations. This has to happen. Until gas prices are high enough, we'll keep driving. Until weather is unbearably hot, until storms are even more destructive, until the edges of the country are underwater, I think we will not change our ways. We will continue in our flagrant use of fossil fuels. Unfortunately, knowledge is not enough to stimulate change. Knowledge is not enough. Only felt experience will do that. And so, in order to bring about change, a leader sometimes has to raise the level of anxiety. Now, this is an important principle that I want to bring forward today. Sometimes the leader has to raise the level of anxiety in an organization. Let me give you an example. Martin Luther King Jr. and Lyndon Baines Johnson colluded together to do just that in 1965 to fuel the civil rights movement. In private meetings early that year, Johnson encouraged King to push voting rights, believing that public pressure might allow legislative action. Johnson wanted to ripen the issue. On Sunday, March the 7th, 1965, Black Americans and whites, in solidarity with them, set out to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. You know that story. Selma had around 29,000 people, and slightly more of them black than white. But only 3% of the people at the voting polls were black. At this time, lay people, nuns, priests, and ministers from all over the country, including many Unitarian Universalist ministers and most of the UUA board, drove in or bussed in or flew in to Selma. Governor Wallace sent the state police against the 600 marchers, and Americans all over the country witnessed with shock and deep anger the televised scenes of black men and women and children being clubbed to the ground, choking, on tear gas and being bullwhipped by troopers. One of our ministers, as you know, James Reed, was clubbed by a group of white men and died a few days later. Demonstrations sprang up all over the country demanding that President Johnson do something. Pressure grew, pickets surrounded the White House with signs shaming the president. Well, the issue had ripened all right. The following Sunday, while 15,000 demonstrators sang "We Shall Overcome," Johnson asked to appear before a joint session of Congress the next evening to do what he had wanted to do all along, make his historic speech asking for voting rights for all citizens. By inaction, Johnson raised the level of tension, says Heifetz, so that people could no longer ignore their responsibility. The issue could no longer be framed as states' rights. The issue was racism, and it was witnessed in living rooms, on television, every night. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act on August the 6th, 1965, and 6 months later, 9,000 black citizens in Selma were registered to vote. This would be a good time to talk about the proper use of power. A lot of us fear power, and for good reason. We have all seen power misused, sometimes personally and often institutionally. Consider the suffering caused by millions in the recent misuse of power in the financial industry. Unitarian Universalists as a group are particularly ambivalent about power. We distrust it. Ours is a free faith, and that's what makes us unique, I think, as a religious people. No religious tradition, no scripture, no priest, no prophet, no authority is predominant over the conscience of the individual believer. But there is a shadow side to our freedom of belief, and that shadow is discomfort with authority. In fact, one of our favorite bumper stickers, isn't it, is "Question authority." We attract highly intelligent people with strongly held opinions, many of whom find it difficult to play in an orchestra, so to speak, and are more comfortable as soloists. Have you ever noticed that? The problem is that in order to build a strong institution, close attention must be given to structure and leadership, and yes, exercise of power. This fear and distrust of authority is particularly problematic when it adversely affects the relationship of the congregants to their minister. The minister is pastor, preacher, as well as institutional leader. Now, in this leadership role, the professional minister works with lay leaders to keep the church focused on mission and gives lay leaders guidance and support in carrying out that mission. It is a contractual relationship in that the minister is paid for services rendered, but that contract is wholly subordinate to the covenantal relationship, which is a sacred partnership grounded in love and trust. However, in many of our churches, lay leaders have patterned their relationship with their minister after the model of the federal government, with checks and balances of power. And the relationship becomes adversarial, with lay leaders making sure that the minister doesn't gain too much power. I remember when, in my church, when we went to policy governance, the cry was, the ministers are going to have too much power. Well, like, what was I going to do with all that power? You know? I don't know. Maybe use it for something good? Do you trust your minister? That's the question. If you don't trust your minister, get another minister, you know? And if you trust your minister, let's all have power together and enhance one another's power. That's the way it's supposed to work, if the relationship is a healthy and a trusting one. So, in and of itself, power is neither good nor evil. It is morally neutral. It can be used for nefarious ends, or it can be used to heal and to bring justice. It just depends on the spiritual maturity of the one who wields the power. and the purpose for which it's used. Now, the word power comes from the Latin potere, meaning to be able, to be able. If one is powerful, one is able, one is potent, one is capable. Then, of course, the element of dominance or control begins to rear its ugly head. What about that? People will ask. Can we act, can we exercise power, or indeed can we dominate, that ugly word, can we dominate without domination being onerous? An adjunct question is whether or not we should do away with hierarchy in our organizational life. And I've heard that question quite a bit. The term hierarchy has a strong negative connotation these days in Unitarian Universalist circles because of its association with economic or social class. Let me be clear. No Unitarian Universalist should support a hierarchy of value. Our first principle says it will. Everyone has inherent worth and dignity. And inherent is not subject to conditions of wealth or circumstances of birth. But when hierarchy refers to the order and discipline of an organization, the word takes on positive value in that such an arrangement makes it possible for the mission of the organization to be clearly focused upon and carried out. You will notice that the Occupy movement, for example, purports to be non-hierarchical, to have no leaders. But of course, leaders have emerged because they always will, because leadership is necessary for any organization to operate and exercise ongoing influence. Again, let's define some terms before we go further. By dominance, I mean, and this is right out of the dictionary, to exert the determining or guiding influence. That's all. To exert the determining or guiding influence. That's what leaders do. A board president once said this to me. She said, a leader puts a leash on the big dog and then follows where that dog pulls you. Wrong. Wrong. The dog might pull you, for example, to remove civil rights from gays and lesbians, or in earlier days, into a lynch mob. Leaders often go against the will of the people. In fact, by definition, leaders must see beyond what is to what could be. So what about control? To say that someone has a controlling personality is not a compliment. And people have said that sometimes about me. That's okay. Yet we all admire those people who can take control when the situation calls for it. We talk about crowd control, the absence of which brings chaos and even death. We are all familiar with the situation in which the facilitator of a question-and-answer session is passive and allows the audience members to drone on with lengthy comments of their own, ignoring the needs of the group, and people are thinking, why doesn't the leader take control? Presumably, we want the President of the United States to have a strong sense of control, giving all the forces that are coming at him. Control, by definition, simply means the power or authority to manage. I am simply advocating for leadership here, and I'm speaking for leadership grounded in a formal structure so that everyone in the organization knows who is responsible for what and who is accountable to whom. When organizational structure is formal and clear, then communication flows easily, questions are answered readily, and responsibility is taken. On the other hand, when leadership of an organization is ambiguous, the result is confusion about responsibilities and a bottlenecking around decision-making. There is no such thing as a leaderless group, for if there is no assigned or elected leader, an informal leader will emerge. Also, if power structures are unclear, power will be exercised in covert ways under the table instead of being exercised openly by persons who are accountable for decisions. Those who actively seek power because they are insecure or needy are the least able to handle it. And in our churches, these people are too often allowed to dominate groups and meetings. There is a kind of deference to the underdog in Unitarian Universalism. That is, nobody's opinion should be considered better than anybody else's. Well, that's kind of silly. And then many lay leaders and many ministers are simply conflict averse, would rather not risk offending anyone, even at the expense of the health and well-being of the institution. Power used in the service of others should be honored and supported, but power that is colored by ambition or tyranny or selfishness should be called out and resisted. Lay leaders, you should call it out. If power is being misused in your churches, you should call it out and resist it. Note, to be a spiritual leader is not to be weak or passive or permissive. During the last year of my ministry in Portland, the economic turndown came and gifts were way down, and the budget didn't come together, and so I took an extraordinary step. I exercised what some people might consider overweening power. You can judge for yourself. I'll tell you the story. We were facing a financial crisis. We were already operating on what I consider a bare bones staff. So I hesitated to cut staff, and I didn't want to reduce the salaries of my hardworking staff. So what should I do? Well, I knew that there was more money to be had in the congregation. There's always more money to be had in the congregation. But people were afraid. Now, there were dire predictions about the economy, and of course they were afraid. So I decided to put before the congregants the consequences of the failed canvass. After explaining my plan to the board, I announced to the congregation that we would close the church for the month of July. It was a simple and straightforward solution. The staff would not have to work if, they were not getting paid. Pastoral emergencies would be seen to as usual. Well, there were two results from this decision. First of all, the news was reported in the local paper and on the radio and traveled all over the country. Headline, local church closes because of the weak economy. Somehow it was just a huge shock to everyone that anyone would close a church. How can this be? And then, appalled that our church might actually close, someone in the church donated a large sum of money as a challenge grant so that the church could stay open. Now, had I cut the staff or cut the salaries of all the staff, the congregation would have accepted that easily enough. They would have said, oh, well, that's okay. That's the way it has to be. The solution, however, shifted the problem from the ministers and the staff to where it belonged, to the congregation. That story has a happy ending, but all my decisions did not turn out so well. First Unitarian was my first church, and I made many mistakes. But practically speaking, you can make a lot of mistakes and be an effective leader. Now, this is a lay leader or a minister, and I'm speaking to both lay leaders and ministers here, if you focus on two of the most significant things. Now, this is the most important thing I'm going to be saying to you today. I'm saying a lot of stuff. This is a long speech. But if you want to remember just one thing, try remembering just this. If you want to be an effective leader, focus on the two most significant things. Number one, stay on your spiritual path, whatever that might be. And number two, stay focused on the mission of the institution. Those two things. But how many leaders actually do that? It sounds so simple. Stay on your spiritual path. Be consistent about having a spiritual discipline. And number two, stay focused on the mission of the institution. In terms of spiritual path, as I said, this was my first church. Portland was. It was a large church. I didn't know anybody in Portland when I arrived there. I knew instinctively that I would fail beyond any hope unless I threw myself absolutely on the mercy of my God. as I would put it. And so I did maintain a consistent spiritual practice during my ministry. And I became clear in the early months of my ministry about the mission of our church. It was an urban church, and every day I saw homeless people walking in the streets. Needles and condoms were left on the sidewalk from the night before. Teenagers were sleeping in the doorway to the church on Sunday morning when I arrived. I mean, I got it. I got it. Just by opening my eyes to what was around me. The purpose of the church was for the members to grow spiritually and to bless the larger world. That's it. That's simple. We became a strong justice church. How could we be anything else, considering where we were? And then to lead, one other point about leadership. To lead, you must know yourself. You must know yourself. I did ask a church consultant in preparing for this talk. I asked a church consultant what gets leaders in trouble. And she said, sometimes they don't know themselves. She said they have to know themselves. By knowing yourself, I mean, first and foremost, become intimately familiar with the issues of your family of origin. Sometimes we uncover patterns that have to do with social class or trauma that occurred early in the family, alcoholism in the family, early death of a family member, financial difficulties, abuse of one kind or another, all kinds of things, experiences that have affected the way that you see the world and your place in the world. Virtually all of us have issues with our family of origin. And generally, we can count on the fact that when we become hooked on some issue, defensive and confused, unable to handle it well as a leader, you pretty much know you've dipped into some unresolved childhood stuff. So it's really important that you know who you are now. This does not mean that you can change your childhood. You can't change your childhood, but you can be aware of these formative experiences and how they affect you as an adult. Now, I'm going to move on to some comments about spiritual development. First of all, I want to talk about the word spiritual. The word spiritual. I mean, that word is used in churches and in cocktail parties. I mean, what does it mean? So, I'm not talking about theology here. Let me be clear. I'm not talking about whether you're a Christian or a Jew or a Buddhist or an atheist or an agnostic. Spirituality is not something esoteric or otherworldly. It's not about fasting or traveling to some holy site or sitting at the foot of some revered teacher. Now, you can do all these things that might help you along the spiritual way, but spirituality is much more basic than that. When I say spirituality, I'm talking about the essence of what we are as a human being. I'm talking about ultimate meaning. What are you ultimately accountable to? Whose are you? That's what I'm talking about when I say spirituality. We're generally led to spiritual growth by asking these questions, these big questions, these ultimate questions. We're generally led to that kind of questioning out of suffering. We want relief. We find that living as we have been living is becoming increasingly intolerable. Our addictions aren't working so well, and our fantasies are growing shaky. Once I heard Jungian James Hollis say in a workshop, he said, most human behavior is an effort to escape anxiety. I really like that. Most human behavior is an effort to escape anxiety. I think he's right. So how do we do that? How do we attempt to escape anxiety? This is how we do it. We tell ourselves stories. In other words, we construct a reality. Our brains are really good at this, and so they work overtime, keeping us safe from reality. Of course, we already have some basic stories that have been constructed as we grow up. They're cultural stories, and they're stories from our family. Some of these are positive, and some of these are not so positive. As we carry on through life, we elaborate upon these stories. We change them according to our unfolding experience, and we construct, that's the word, construct, what is known as an ego. We call this a self. This ego or self then goes about the world interpreting events and people and words and so forth according to this story that has been constructed. The ego is the me, and the others are the not me. Others get to take all the characteristics that we don't want to own or the shadow parts of ourselves. We find that we can't entirely escape the realities of life. However, realities like death and loss and betrayal, we can't escape suffering. So we begin to look for a new way. But some of us are stubborn. Count me in on that lot. We try for a long time to avoid just accepting who we are and being with reality as it is. One of my chief coping mechanisms is trying to be good. If only I can be good enough, pure enough, totally unsullied, actually, then I can hold my little constructed world together. I learned to follow all the rules. It was not for nothing that I was elected best Christian when I was a senior in high school. It was an honor which failed dismally in attracting the opposite sex. Naturally enough, I became a minister. Now this persona of personal virtue that I have adopted is absolute, unadulterated fantasy, of course. I think I latched onto this particular one early in life because of the flagrant sins of my charming and handsome alcoholic father. Someone had to, balance out my father's badness, and it might as well be me. But, as a matter of fact, I have a huge amount of aggression in me, and I get in touch with this in certain predictable situations. For example, at the airport. Sometimes at the airport, I find myself surrounded by people who are separated from one another, connected to their respective cell phones, just whiling away the time in chatter. Now, I've done a lot of traveling lately, and I've been stuck in airports for long periods of time. Not long ago, I spent 7.5 hours right here in your Chicago O'Hare Airport. Let me tell you what happened. So I'm sitting there, I'm packed in with thousands of other people who've had their flights canceled by too much wind in the Windy City, what the airline is calling an act of God, so they won't have to give us any food or put us up for the night. So I'm sitting there, and this svelte blonde, perfectly coiffed, dressed to the nines, comes up and asks if the seat next to me is vacant. She sits gingerly on the edge of her seat. She is carrying inside her jacket a live creature that pokes its head out to survey the scene. It is a dog, a little Yorkie. And she begins feeding it a McDonald's hamburger, saying how little Fifi wouldn't eat anything else. She engages me in conversation, and I reluctantly put down my contemplative reading and pay attention to her and little Fifi. She asks me where I'm going, and I foolishly tell her. I say, I'm going to Lexington, Kentucky to marry my best friend. And then realizing that she might misinterpret my remark, I add, I mean I'm going to do the ceremony. I'm a minister. Big mistake. She perks up. Fifi perks up. She grills me with one question after another. What kind of minister? Oh, I've never heard of that. What do they believe? That's interesting. Does it bother you that some of your people are not saved? Do you believe in Jesus? I believe in John 3:16. Do you know that verse? Have you ever read the Bible? At that moment, I truly wanted to smash a framed copy of my PhD in theology over her head. As I remember, I did the verbal equivalent of that. This is not what I call acting from my Buddha nature. So I'm supposedly a peacemaker, but I have a huge amount of aggression in me. So what do I do with that? I need to ask myself that question. Another fantasy that we construct for ourselves is a belief that things won't change. Things that we like, situations that make us comfortable, things won't change. But of course they do, ever and always. And the shift always feels like such a violation somehow. The other day I was moving a plant, a gorgeous blooming amaryllis, the last of the season, and I hit the stem against something and the flower broke off, just like that. For a moment I considered Scotch tape. But no, that wouldn't work. The flower was so beautiful and now it was dying. How often is something that we love, a vase, a job, a home, a relationship, how often, it's just perfect, just the way we want it, only to have things surprise us by disappearing or becoming something else as we watch helplessly. Let me tell you a story about impermanence and compassion. This is a true story. It was told to me by one of the family members. A husband and wife were hosting a fancy dinner party, and they brought out all their best china and their silver and crystal for their guests. Everyone was having a lovely time, and then one of the women guests accidentally broke one of the very expensive crystal glasses, and this woman gasped in horror. Everyone stopped talking, and at this point, the host, fearing the judgment of his wife upon their guest, because the wife did tend to be judgmental, the host picked up his glass, smiled, and he said, "Don't worry about it, it happens all the time." And he nonchalantly broke his glass against the side of the table. Crash. I wish I could have done something like that. I could never do it, but I love that story. I love that story. The one thing that we can depend on is that we cannot depend on anything. Everything in the world is unreliable and temporary. So what do? We do not add another dimension of suffering to our original laws by saying to ourselves things shouldn't be that way, or going into denial or trying to change something or someone who cannot be changed. We learn to go forward in love, knowing that all is precisely as it is and all is impermanent. I hear the echo of that man's words at the dinner party. Don't worry about it. Happens all the time. Some of you may have experienced the peace and grace of a Japanese tea ceremony. The cups and bowls in this traditional ceremony are always treated with great care and respect, and so a cup was rarely broken. But when one was broken, the cup was sometimes repaired with gold, leaving shining tracks that were clearly seen on the bowl or cup. Rather than trying to cover up the break, the cracks were celebrated, announcing to the world that the cup had been broken and was repaired and was vulnerable to change. And in this way, its value was even further enhanced. Why is it that we tend to deny and cover up our mistakes? Why? It is so freeing to say, "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I behaved like a real jerk. I hope that you'll forgive me." When we break, we change, we mend, and we may very well grow stronger. Maybe some of you have read Catherine Schultz's recent book, Being Wrong. I recommend that. Being wrong. She points out it's so difficult to admit that we were wrong, and it's such a positive act. By being wrong, of course, it's the only way we grow. When we have had enough of the false escapes, enough of the trying to look good, enough of the self-righteousness that divides us from others and from the holy, we want transformation, and we come to our spiritual practice. We come to pray, or we come to contemplate, or we come to sit in meditation. And what do we discover? Same old stuff. Anxiety, anger, envy, more false escapes, trying to be holier than others, even through our spiritual practice. And so we sit with all of this human stuff. We sit and sit and sit. We give up our shoulds. We say, I am who I am right now. We stop trying to fix ourselves and stop judging and fixing others. For this present moment, this moment of presence at least, we have broken the illusion that we are separate. We accept ourselves as we are in that moment. We accept reality as it is in that moment, and we ask only for that awareness and that acceptance. The mind quiets. We're breathing more deeply now, more air coming in. The story that we're not good enough, not worthy to be loved, goes. The story that everything will stay goes. The story that our hunger will one day be met, that goes. And yet, paradoxically, all is well with our soul. Myth, prayer, poetry, meditation, these take us into deep time where we can experience healing and a new kind of consciousness. There are many paths, many ways, many kinds of spiritual practice. The time and the method matter not, only the true longing of your heart. Only the true longing of your heart. One day you may find that you are praying without ceasing and your life has become a prayer. Then you are not so apt to be shaken by the surprises that existence lays on all of us. You are still enough, strong enough, soft enough to lead. Church leaders with spiritual grounding can help church members see themselves as a people called out to a larger purpose in the world, a purpose larger than their own needs. A church's mission should be more profound than hanging out with people like ourselves. Yes, we will gain community at church, but in the context of a devotion to something larger than ourselves, we would be aware that we are called to use our power for good in a world in which the worst holds power through greed, and people follow blindly. Who will redeem such a world? At church, it's important to build in spiritual components, to build them into every meeting, every retreat, every dinner. Our church is not just any secular group getting together about an issue. Every meeting, including board meetings and finance committee meetings, yes, finance committee meetings, every gathering should have a sacred dimension because that gathering is generated by and held in a church. And we can offer support, covenant groups of various kinds, classes and so forth, to deepen the spiritual lives in the consciousness of our members and friends. We can provide a place where people can grieve and meditate and pray and play, a place to be renewed spiritually and emotionally, a place where people can be safe as in no other place, to share with others their struggles, their hopes, their failures, and their successes. When people come together in the name of something larger than themselves, to heal, to grow, to work for change, they feel their power, their creativity, their unity, and their joy. These are sustaining feelings that will take us through the tough times, that will keep us focused, that will give us courage. This is not spirituality somewhere off on top of a mountain somewhere alone. This is a relational spirituality that acknowledges our kinship, the one with the other. The spiritually grounded leader doesn't have to act powerful. Such leaders are powerful by virtue of their bearing and their presence. Others feel this power before a word is spoken. Such a leader invites others into their own power. When a leader accepts the challenge and steps faithfully into appropriate power and leads with strength and love, power will be greatly multiplied. Then the body of people are likely to be blessed and in turn are likely to be used, to use their power, and are likely to be used to bless the world. So be it. Amen. Thank you.